1. I cheated. He forgave me, but now he says he won't promise to stay. Every time I raise my voice or have a bad day, I see it in his eyes. He's measuring whether I'm worth the risk. And now, I'm starting to wonder if he ever really meant to forgive me at all. Or if he was just waiting for the perfect excuse to leave. The birthday planning thing became this weird test between us. I'd bring it up every few days, asking if he wanted to look at restaurants or maybe plan a weekend getaway. And he'd always find some excuse to avoid making concrete plans. He'd say things like, "Let's see how things go," or, "Maybe we should wait a bit longer," which basically meant he still wasn't sure if he wanted to be with me in a few months. But then, when I got upset about not being able to plan anything, he'd turn it around and say I was being unreasonable for wanting guarantees about the future. I started paying really close attention to his phone and his behavior, looking for signs that he was already emotionally checked out or maybe even talking to someone else. I mean, if he was so ready to leave me, maybe he was already lining up his next option. When I'd ask him about his day or who he talked to, he'd get defensive and say I was being paranoid. But how was I supposed to not be paranoid when he literally told me he might leave at any time during this whole period? I'll admit I started testing him a little bit. Like, if he was going to leave anyway over small things, I wanted to know where the line actually was. So when he'd annoy me or do something inconsiderate, I'd react the way I normally would instead of walking on eggshells. If he left dishes in the sink after I'd cleaned the kitchen, I'd say something about it. If he was late getting home without texting me, I'd express that I was frustrated. Normal relationship stuff that every couple deals with. But Bennett would respond to these completely normal interactions by pulling away emotionally. He wouldn't fight back or defend himself like he used to. He'd just go quiet and distant, which somehow felt worse than arguing. It was like he was already practicing for life without me, just disengaging instead of working through problems like married people should. I tried explaining to him that this whole dynamic was making me feel like I was dating him instead of being married to him. Marriage is supposed to be about unconditional commitment, for better or worse. But he was treating our relationship like some kind of trial period where I had to prove myself worthy of staying. When I pointed this out, he'd say I was the one who broke the unconditional trust. So now we had to rebuild it slowly. But how are you supposed to rebuild trust when the other person won't even commit to trying? The worst part was how he'd use my past mistakes against me in subtle ways. If I got frustrated about something completely unrelated to our marriage, he'd get this look like, "There's the real Harley coming out again." If I wanted to make plans or buy something for the house, he'd hesitate like he wasn't sure we'd be together long enough for it to matter. Every single interaction felt loaded with the potential for him to decide I wasn't worth the effort anymore. By this point, I was starting to feel like I was married to a stranger who was just waiting for me to give him a reason to leave. The man I married would have fought for us, would have been committed to working through problems together. This new version of Bennett felt like he had already moved on emotionally and was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. Everything finally exploded over something so ridiculous that I still can't believe it ended our marriage. We were having a perfectly normal Saturday morning. Bennett was making coffee, I was getting the kids ready for their activities. Just regular family stuff. Landon started complaining about having to go to his friend's house because he wanted to stay home and play video games instead. I told him he needed to keep his commitment and stop whining about every single plan we made for him. Bennett jumped in and started undermining me, saying, maybe we should let Landon stay home since he seemed really tired. I pointed out that we can't just cancel plans last minute because our kid decides he doesn't feel like doing something anymore, and that this was exactly the kind of inconsistent parenting that made our kids so spoiled and difficult. Instead of backing me up like a partner should, Bennett got all defensive and said I was being too harsh. So I reminded him that these are the same kids who ruined our expensive vacation with their constant complaining. And maybe if we actually followed through on consequences once in a while, they'd learn some respect and gratitude. That's when Bennett completely lost it. He said this was exactly what he'd been afraid of, me going right back to taking my frustrations out on everyone around me and turning every small disagreement into a character assassination. He said I was doing the same thing I did before my affair, making everyone else responsible for my bad moods and using criticism to control situations. I couldn't believe he was bringing up the affair over a simple parenting disagreement. I told him he was being ridiculous and that normal couples have different opinions about discipline without it meaning anything deeper. But he just looked at me with this cold expression and said he wasn't going to live like this again. Constantly walking on eggshells around my moods and having every family interaction turn into a criticism session. When I tried to explain that I was just trying to be a good parent and teach our kids some responsibility, he said it wasn't what I was saying but how I was saying it, with this angry, contemptuous tone that made everyone around me feel attacked. He said he'd forgotten how exhausting it was to live with someone who always had to be right and always had to make other people wrong to feel better about themselves. I was completely shocked that he was making such a big deal out of nothing. I said he was overreacting and that if he couldn't handle normal family stress without threatening our marriage, maybe he was the one with the problem. That's when he said something that still makes me angry when I think about it. He said he'd rather be alone than spend the rest of his life feeling like he had to manage my emotions and protect our kids from my moods. Bennett started making phone calls that same day, to his lawyer, to his brother about staying there temporarily, to the kids' schools about changing pickup arrangements. I couldn't believe he was being so dramatic over one argument. When I tried to talk to him about it, He said this wasn't about one argument but about a pattern that he could see was never going to change. I called my sister and my mom, expecting them to be outraged at how Bennett was acting, but they both seemed hesitant to take my side completely. My sister even said maybe some space would be good for both of us to figure things out, which felt like a betrayal when I needed support. My mom suggested maybe Bennett had a point about my tones sometimes being harsh, which was the last thing I needed to hear. Some of our mutual friends were even worse. When I explained what happened, they'd listen and nod but wouldn't automatically say Bennett was wrong. A couple of them actually said they understood why he felt like he needed to protect himself, which made me realize that maybe people had been talking about our marriage behind my back all along. The final conversation Bennett and I had before he moved out was him trying to explain that he'd given our marriage everything he had for over a year but he couldn't keep living in fear of my next bad mood or criticism session. He said he loved me but couldn't sacrifice his own mental health and our kids' emotional well-being to prove his commitment to someone who wasn't willing to change fundamental things about how she treated people. I told him he was breaking up our family over normal marriage problems and that